In 1943, British and American air forces decided to combine their efforts to destroy Germany's military industry. To achieve this, they carried out numerous bombings in cities such as Essen, Hanover, and Hamburg. The latter was first attacked on the night of July 24th by the British Royal Air Force, while on July 25th and 26th it was American aircraft that took on the task of bombing the city. By the night of July 27th, nearly half of Hamburg was without power. Thousands of buildings had been destroyed, and the death toll had reached into the thousands. And yet, after that night, all of that devastation would seem small compared to what was about to happen when British aircraft returned for a second bombing during Operation Gomorrah. By the afternoon of July 27th, most of the major fires affecting Hamburg had been brought under control by the city's firefighters and others who had come to help from nearby cities like Hanover. Threatened by the Gestapo, the firefighters' tireless three-day effort managed to suppress the fires, reducing them to just over 1,000 smaller blazes still burning. For this reason, the chief of police described the city's situation on the night of July 27th as stable. It was an unusually warm and dry day in Hamburg. The city had endured heavy bombing raids by the USAAF Air Force and the RAF Bomber Command for 3 consecutive days. That night would be no exception. At 10 p.m., a force of 787 bombers, composed of 74 Vickers Wellingtons, 116 short Stirlings, 244 Handley Page Halifaxes, and 353 Avro Lancasters, took off from air bases in the United Kingdom and headed toward the North Sea. Their objective that night was to completely overwhelm the city's emergency services. To do so, they aimed to strike the working-class neighborhoods of Billwerder, Borgfelder, Hammerbrook, Hohenfelder, and Rothenburgsort. The aircraft were carrying an extra 240 tons of incendiary bombs, based on the British belief that these caused the most damage. To confirm this, U.S. Brigadier General Fred Anderson flew as co-pilot in one of the Lancaster Pathfinders. Meanwhile, at 11:40 p.m., air raid sirens once again alerted the entire city of Hamburg. Civilians, exhausted from sleepless nights, knew the sound meant the planes were less than 30 minutes away, so they rushed to the underground shelters. However, by midnight, no bombs had fallen, nor was the sound of aircraft engines heard. Believing it was a false alarm, many residents decided to return to their homes. At 12:30 a.m., the British bomber formation approached the German coast. Of the 787 that had taken off from Britain, some had to abandon the mission due to mechanical failures. Even so, they soon reached Position A, about 80 kilometers from the German province of Schleswig-Holstein, where once again they began releasing window strips to confuse Nazi radar systems. 25 minutes later, the drone of heavy bombers was heard over the city. For countless residents, it would be the last sound they would ever hear. The first Lancaster Pathfinder bomber reached Hamburg and began dropping yellow flares to mark targets 3 kilometers east of the city center, in the heart of the Hammerbrook district. To divert the bombers, German defenders launched red flares 16 kilometers to the west. But that night, the Pathfinders were not using red, so the German deception failed. This time, the flares landed on the exact intended targets. The yellow and green lights guided the first wave of Lancasters to where the bombing should begin. At 12:57 a.m., the first incendiary and explosive bombs fell on the city. German anti-aircraft fire was scattered and far weaker than on previous nights, allowing the bombers to strike with precision. Just as on July 24th, German defenses were unable to stop the RAF from breaking the world record for the most explosives dropped on a single city. This time, 2,313 tons of bombs were dropped on Hamburg, concentrated mainly in one sector. Shortly after 1 a.m., a strange phenomenon began to occur in the Hammerbrook district. That day had been very hot in Hamburg, with temperatures reaching up to 30 degrees Celsius and very low humidity, which had created a bubble of unstable hot air over the city, fed by the smoke and flames from earlier attacks. But the nearly 100,000 incendiary bombs released that night burst the bubble, causing the hot air to rise, absorbing more oxygen, and feeding the thousands of smaller fires until they merged into one. British crews witnessed the birth of the Firestorm. They felt a mix of fascination, satisfaction, and horror. They had never seen a fire of such magnitude, and they never would again. The fire quickly fed on the dry wood and became self-sustaining, expanding into a sea of flames. Survivors described it as if the air itself were on fire, and they were not far from the truth. As the inferno spread, temperatures skyrocketed, reaching a minimum of 800 degrees Celsius, enough to make stone glow, glass explode, and wood, fabric, and human hair spontaneously ignite. The fire tornado created a massive hellscape. The flames rose higher than 300 meters, effortlessly incinerating an area of more than 21 square kilometers. The narrow streets channeled the searing air, and currents collided at intersections, forming fire tornadoes with winds reaching up to 240 kilometers per hour, strong enough to uproot trees and hurl them into the air. The tornadoes looked like clouds of sparks and flame that ignited everything they touched, whether clothing or skin. They pulled in nearby civilians and incinerated them. Those fortunate enough to escape would never forget the screams of pain from the victims and the monstrous roar of the storm. The wind howled like a demon come to Hamburg to feed on human despair. Roofs flew into the air. The streets burned with phosphorus from the incendiary bombs. 2 women, one young, one older, who were fleeing, became trapped in the boiling asphalt. They stepped out of their shoes, but had to walk barefoot on the blistering surface. They dropped like flies in the hot wax of a candle and never got up again. Apartment blocks turned into towers of fire, and everyone who didn't escape or chose to stay inside burned to death. Clothes fused with skin, flesh melted in basements and bomb shelters. Those not incinerated died of suffocation. Those who reached the Elbe River jumped into the water to escape, but many were already burning with phosphorus and continued to burn even underwater until they died. Many who survived the nightmare did so by sheer luck. Some happened to be near open spaces or empty lots that acted as fire breaks. Others, by chance, found themselves near sealed public shelters that were spared due to the lack of oxygen. At 1:21 a.m., a group of German wild boar fighters reached the city. They were led by Major Hermann Hogeback, who later testified to being shaken by the thick clouds of smoke over Hamburg. Hogeback and his small group of Bf 109 and FW 190 fighters attacked the bombers and managed to shoot down up to 4 Lancaster aircraft. But the German group was too small to make any real difference that night. At 1:47 a.m., a Halifax from Squadron 427 dropped the last bombs of the night. The attack had been a success, with only 17 bombers lost to German fighters and anti-aircraft fire. Once again, the window technology had helped save the lives of the young British airmen. With the mission complete, the aircraft turned southwest toward the North Sea, and from there back to the United Kingdom. As they headed home, many British crew members cast a final glance at Hamburg. Columns of smoke rose more than 6,000 meters, and the glow of the flames could be seen from miles away. On the ground, there was nothing but a sea of fire, and as the planes returned to England, the hot smoke met the cold air in the upper atmosphere, causing black rain to begin falling. This was only the beginning of the nightmares for the city's residents. The firestorm kept gaining strength as it incinerated entire city blocks. By 2 a.m., the winds were so intense that firefighters had to crawl on their knees to make progress. In the center of Hammerbrook, temperatures had reached 1,000 degrees Celsius. By then, anyone who hadn't made it to a shelter had perished in their homes or on the narrow streets. However, the extreme heat, poisonous gases, and smoke forced many civilians out of the shelters to try to reach safer locations. To survive, they had to battle hurricane-force winds, flames, and flying embers. Their only hope was to reach public parks or open spaces that served as fire breaks. Little by little, the firestorm began to run out of combustible material, and around 4 a.m., the flames started to weaken, and the fire tornadoes quickly died down. The wind subsided, and breathable air returned to the affected zones. Nazi commanders ordered the evacuation of all non-essential civilians. Survivors who had escaped the night's hell were gathered and organized near Hamburg University in an old park called Moorweide. As if it were some cruel cosmic joke, this was the same park where Hamburg's Jews had been forced to gather before being transported in cattle cars to the extermination camps in Minsk, where they were later executed in the forests. That morning, the German survivors of Hamburg were gathered in the very place from which Jews had once been sent to their deaths. All train lines were destroyed except for 3, so more than 1 million people fled Hamburg on foot, seeking refuge in nearby towns and cities. Many who left that day never returned. At 7 a.m. on July 28th, the sun was nowhere to be seen. The city was shrouded in darkness from the thick columns of smoke that would block out the sun for several days, plunging the city into a kind of winter gloom. By then, the firestorm had completely dissipated, leaving only massive fires across eastern Hamburg. However, firefighters and rescue teams would have to wait another 2 days for the heat to subside enough to reach the epicenter of the firestorm. But no one was in a hurry. Everyone was convinced that there was nothing and no one left to save. The scene in Hamburg was desolate. All around lay the charred bodies of the dead. To assist with the cleanup, German authorities sent orders to the Neuengamme concentration camp to provide workers. As a result, Polish and Soviet prisoners of war were forced to march into the ruins of Hamburg to recover corpses and bury them in mass graves. Even so, they weren't the ones who suffered the worst fate. Common criminals were forced to form suicide squads tasked with manually disarming unexploded bombs. A horrific and miserable job that only added to the death toll. The human cost of the July 27th British bombing raid was unprecedented in history. The lack of identifiable bodies made it difficult to determine an exact death toll. Some historians estimate that around 18,000 people died, the vast majority while fleeing in search of shelter. However, other researchers suggest numbers between 35,000 and 42,000 dead. By comparison, the entire Blitz killed 43,000 Britons over 8 months. Never before had a bombing of such magnitude been seen, and the worst part was that it wasn't over yet. The next day, on the morning of July 29th, a reconnaissance Spitfire from RAF Squadron 542 reported clear weather and that most of the smoke over Hamburg had dissipated, making another air raid possible. By then, only emergency services, essential workers, and the elderly and sick, who couldn't flee, remained in the city. Most believed a third large-scale bombing made no sense, but that night, another 771 bombers took off from England and began their route toward the North Sea. Their mission was to attack the city centre and destroy the neighbourhoods of Rotherbaum, Harvesterhude, Eimsbüttel, and Eppendorf. 45 of the British bombers had to return before reaching the target. As the rest of the group crossed the North Sea, they began to notice a faint glow in the distance, growing stronger as they approached. The crews quickly realized it was still Hamburg, still burning. The Pathfinders began dropping yellow flares to mark the route, which attracted German fighters. British Mosquito aircraft then created a diversion using flares and window technology near the German coast, 100 kilometers west of Hamburg, toward the city of Bremen. This caused some fighters to divert, but for Luftwaffe leaders, it was clear that Hamburg was once again the real target that night. This time, the Germans were better prepared. Radar operators now recognized the window patterns from about 50 kilometers before the coast and were learning to distinguish between ghost contacts and real aircraft. For this reason, night fighters were deployed, allowing the Luftwaffe to gather information on the direction and strength of the approaching British attack. As the bombers crossed the St. Peter Peninsula, Nazi fighters managed to shoot down 8 planes. But although the fighters harassed the bombers, the majority of the British formation navigated to Hamburg without serious trouble. When the air raid sirens wailed again in the early morning, the streets emptied quickly. Silence took hold of Hamburg. Every district was deserted, and nothing and no one disturbed the stillness. At that moment, Hamburg had become a ghost city, awaiting another long night. But this time, Nazi defenses had been reorganized. More spotlights scanned the skies with greater discipline, occasionally forming large cones of light to illuminate the British bombers. This time, the mission would be more difficult. Anti-aircraft artillery shot down 3 bombers, and Major Hogeback, leading the Wild Boars and a night fighter squadron, brought down 7 more aircraft and damaged 12 others. This resistance came as an unpleasant surprise to the Royal Air Force crews. Even so, the defense effort didn't prevent the civilian population from suffering once more under the bombs. Those who hadn't managed to flee took refuge hours in advance, but others chose not to evacuate because they believed the British would strike their neighborhoods for a third time. They were wrong. The Karstadt department store, located in central Hamburg, collapsed after being hit by bombs, trapping more than 1,500 people inside 2 large underground bunkers. Rescuers were only able to save about 1,200 people, as 370 died from carbon monoxide poisoning. On the way back to the UK, 5 more British bombers were shot down. That night, an estimated 800 to 1,000 more people died in Hamburg, but it still wasn't enough for the British. Only a few suburban areas around Hamburg remained untouched, and Marshal Arthur Harris was determined to target them. On August 2nd, 737 British bombers took off once again toward Hamburg. The aircraft were to approach from the south as if heading toward Hanover and then change course toward Hamburg. Once over the city, the first wave of bombers was to drop their payloads on the wealthy neighborhoods of Harvester. Meanwhile, the second wave was to head 8 kilometers south and attack the district of Harburg. However, this second mission was cancelled before takeoff due to poor weather. The British formation began deploying window technology as it reached the island of Heligoland, but had to face a thunderstorm along the flight route, forcing the crews to fly through it while dealing with chunks of ice hitting the aircraft and coating the propellers and control surfaces. The storm caused 4 planes to nearly crash, and 1 was destroyed when struck by lightning. But the main problem was that nearly half of the bombers had to return to base, so the mission would have to proceed with only 393 operational units. Additionally, most of the navigation instruments had been knocked out, and the formation was now very dispersed, rendering the window strips ineffective, as they only work when the formation is dense. German radar detected many aircraft, which were then targeted by night fighters and anti-aircraft batteries. Due to irregular cloud cover, German fighters, and anti-aircraft fire, most Pathfinders failed to locate the city and didn't drop their target markers. As a result, the bombers dropped their bombs almost blindly, producing very poor results. Ironically, some bombs struck the town of Harburg, which had originally been the second planned target. German air defenses were effective and managed to shoot down 8 more British aircraft. The scattered remains of the English formation left the city between 3 and 4 a.m. Later, Bill McRae stated that the 4th bombing was an absolute disaster and should never have happened. The storm, German fighters, and flak combined to cost the British 30 aircraft. Of the 737 bombers that took off from England, only 106 dropped their bombs on target. The rest dropped them over land or abandoned them on alternate targets during the return flight. The final raid was an anticlimactic failure, but Operation Gomorrah was an overwhelming victory for the Allies. In just 1 week, 8,344 tons of explosive and incendiary bombs had been dropped. The Royal Air Force and the United States Air Force together lost only 104 bombers and 714 crew members. This encouraged the high commands of both armies to plan further attacks on Germany. The military objective had been achieved. Germany's second most important city lay devastated. Over half of Hamburg's buildings had been destroyed, leaving nearly 1 million civilians homeless. But most importantly for the Allied troops, between the dead and the displaced, Hamburg's war industry workforce was reduced by nearly half. This severely affected the production of U-boats in the following months, representing a major setback for the German war effort. Moreover, the mass exodus of civilians irreversibly reduced the city's economic value to the German economy, also impacting nearby cities that had to support both the refugees and Hamburg's reconstruction. These were resources that could have been used for the war effort, but were now essential for meeting the basic needs of Hamburg's residents. But this success was built upon tens of thousands of deaths. Historians agree that between July 24th and August 2nd, up to 45,000 people were killed, most during the firestorm in the early morning of July 28th. The death toll from Operation Gomorrah will always be uncertain, but the most accepted figure is 37,000 deaths. Most of the victims were never identified. By December 1st, 1943, 31,647 deaths had been confirmed, but only 15,802 were based on the identification of a corpse. In some cases, the numerous people who died in basements could only be estimated from the amount of ash left on the floor. No later attack on a city shook Germany the way Hamburg did. Documents from the time show that German officials were completely alarmed, and some evidence from later Allied interrogations of Nazi officials suggests that Hitler said new raids of that scale would force Germany to exit the war. The industrial losses were devastating, and Hamburg never regained full production, except in a few essential arms industries. Figures from German sources indicate that 183 large factories out of 524 in the city were destroyed, along with 4,118 smaller factories. Local transportation systems were completely disrupted and took time to return to normal. Entire neighborhoods were razed and would not recover until long after the war ended. Fires burned for weeks, and the city was paralyzed for months. But the effects were felt far beyond Hamburg. Fear of suffering a similar attack spread across all of Germany. In Britain, Gomorrah's success convinced Marshal Arthur Harris that large-scale aerial bombing was the ideal path to ending the war. The skies over Germany soon filled with Allied planes, beginning a pattern of destruction that would devastate around 130 cities. The firestorm that ravaged Hamburg would reduce to ashes and memories the urban centers of Kassel, Darmstadt, and Dresden. But most shocking of all was the wave of civilian anger toward the Nazi government, which forced the SS and Gestapo to unleash brutal repression on the population. Even propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels considered the bombing of Hamburg the greatest crisis of the war. Only the Führer remained indifferent to his people's fate, refusing to visit the city, and the tactic wouldn't be limited to Europe. In the Pacific, American General Curtis LeMay carried out a series of devastating attacks on Japanese cities based on Operation Gomorrah. But that's another video.